So today, I'm going to do a little solo episode about a theme which I think is one of the most important things we're going to cover here at Wake the Future, and we call it pilot versus passenger. And pilot versus passenger is really built all around this metaphor that there are certain things in our lives and in the world that we have little to no control over. And those are areas of our life where we are passengers. And then there are things in our world or in our lives that we have most or full control or agency over. And those are things where we can be the pilot. You get on an airplane, you often don't know who the pilot is. If you did know who the pilot is, you might hate the pilot, or you might think the pilot was some sort of maniac. But the reality is that you sign a contract with yourself when you get on an airplane that you're going to get from your point of origin to your destination safely. And there's little you can do to control that. Now, you can control elements of the experience, but you cannot control the ultimate outcome. So this same principle applies so profoundly in our lives and in the world right now. And I would argue that this is the most important time to be having this conversation, because I'm going to break this into macro and micro. In this episode, we're going to call it part one. We're going to be talking about the macro forces that are impacting all of us, where I would argue we are increasingly passengers. And then in episode two, we're going to be talking about micro forces, where I would argue that we are increasingly, or have the ability to increasingly, be pilots. But this is an important time to be having this conversation, because right now, the macro environment is more unpredictable than at any point in my lifetime. And there are two major factors that play into that I want to talk about. Now, we could go into 30 different things happening in the world, but the two that I want to focus on today that make this conversation, I think, so relevant right now are, one, the whole conversation around the future of artificial intelligence and where that technology is going and how it's going to potentially impact most or all of us and our livelihoods and our jobs. And number two is the war in the Middle East right now. For our purposes today, I just want to talk about the combination of those two things and how if we turn on the news or we go online, there is such a critical mass of information and commentary that basically if we just take it at face value, it is enough to drive any of us mad and make all of us feel anxious and worried about the future and worried about ourselves and our kids. It's a lot. And I want to be very clear. Nothing that I'm saying here is an argument for apathy. In fact, quite the contrary. What I think is going to be very important as we think about these macro forces that we have little to no control over is, instead of going towards apathy and ignorance, we have to have a better understanding of these things so that we can better prepare for those micro decisions that we can control, and we can be in a better position to make those decisions as these macro forces might eventually impact us. But let's break it down again. You have these macro forces. We have very little control over them. I studied psychology when I was in college. That was a long time ago, but I remember this concept of locus of control. If you have a fairly high internal locus of control, then that means that you tend to think that you have more impact or direct agency over things that happen to you. Whereas if you have a very high external locus of control, that means that you generally assign responsibility for things that happen to you to external forces, to other things. The more internal locus of control that we happen to have, the healthier it is for us psychologically. And that makes sense, because the more agency you feel you have over things, I think the more empowered you feel, and you really feel like more of a pilot. So there is a huge psychological component to this. Now, fast forward to today, and we're talking about this crazy, unpredictable macro environment with geopolitical conflict and war and everything happening with AI, and it becomes very easy for people to get anxious about these things that they cannot control. And when they internalize that anxiety, it is one of the worst things that someone can do to themselves, because that metastasizes into something that's not good psychologically, emotionally, physiologically. So we have to think about this as a collective human problem. And we have to think about this as a wellness issue for individual people. So here are some practical tips, because we not only want to shine a light on macro issues that are important, we want to also provide some techniques, without being prescriptive about it, but some techniques that might be helpful to individual people as they wrestle with these things individually and at home and within their families. So this is a multi-step process here. I think step one fundamentally is to acknowledge those things that we have little to no control over. And that would be like war in the Middle East, or what's happening with AI and its eventual impact on white-collar jobs. After we acknowledge those things, we have to accept them. We have to then determine, okay, there might be a lot of crazy stuff happening, and a lot of it might not be very good. However, we have to come to terms with the fact that it's happening. We have to come to terms with the fact that we can't control what's happening more broadly. And once we come to that acceptance, we actually can become a little bit healthier in our outlook. And that ultimately goes towards optimization of our mindset and how we can show up for ourselves and our families. So we have to acknowledge the things we have no control over. We have to accept that we have no control over them. Now, let me stop there for a second. I mentioned a few minutes ago that I'm not arguing for apathy. Actually, quite the opposite. For example, we think about what's happening with artificial intelligence. If we know that artificial intelligence could potentially displace us or people we care about and eliminate their jobs, and we're aware of that, then we can start making very, very particular decisions in our own lives that we can control about how we reskill, how we change our mindset, how we prepare for what might be coming. So basically, the decisions that we have power over, the areas of our lives where we can be pilots, are directly impacted by our awareness of these external factors. Same thing with war. It seems that many people are ignorant to what's happening right now or simply don't care until it affects them in some tangible way. For example, gas prices are higher, thus we have to pay attention to some of what's going on overseas. When in reality, we have to be much more aware of the secondary and tertiary effects of a conflict like this. What it can do to our alliances, what it might do with regard to a prolonged military engagement, what that might mean for the global economy, what it might mean for our kids. There are so many factors there. So we actually have to be more aware of those things. We have to educate ourselves on those things. And that is part of us acknowledging and accepting and then empowering ourselves in our own lives. So I am definitely not arguing for apathy. And I think that's the important thing here. It is differentiating the macro from the micro. It is understanding that these things exist. We have little to no control over them. It is accepting that and coming to terms with it. And then it is focusing much more of that mental pie chart towards things where we can obviously create positive outcomes or we can optimize things for ourselves and for our kids. And I think that will ultimately be so much healthier for people, for the human organism. And another aspect of this, which we have to make sure to talk about because we've brought this up before and it matters to so many of these themes, is where we're going with narrative, where we're going with storytelling, where we're going with news, and where we're going with media. So I think one of the reasons why people are so anxious or feel like things are spiraling so out of control is because you have competing narratives and we often don't even know which of those narratives might be true, might be false, might be real, might be fake. You take this war, for example, there are so many elements of this war where if you go out to wherever you source information, there are going to be competing narratives that include things like photo or video clips that we can no longer verify as real versus AI generated. And what happens in a world like that is not only are we worried about what's happening, but now we're worried about whether or not the information we're seeing is accurate or not. And we know we live in a world characterized by things like fear porn, where eyeballs and attention tend to be driven towards things which are much more sensationalist. So there are people propagating narratives out there about AI and the AI apocalypse and about the war in the Middle East that are designed to get people really concerned. And those narratives may or may not even be accurate. So we have this two-layer type of problem to deal with where we have to internalize this stress about the situation more broadly, and then we have to internalize the stress over the uncertainty about what's real and what's not. And are a lot of these things that are designed to make us anxious actually legitimate? We just don't know. So truth and trust are fundamental components to this, and that goes back to the core point here, which is that in a world of pilot versus passenger, again, we cannot control these macro forces. When you think about the oligarchs and the billionaires and political leaders, there's this concentration of power and influence and authority. So of course, in that situation, we feel like we have even less control as individual people. How are we going to respond, both in the near term and in the long term, to a lot of these things? And how are we going to talk to our kids about these things so that we can hopefully equip them, not just with critical thinking? I think critical thinking is something which is hard to define and is almost thinking about this in yesterday's terms. But how do we equip them with the agency to understand that there are certain things they can control and they should control, and arm them with the right perspective so that they can be responsive to any of these things in the external environment that are surely going to change the trajectory of their lives? That's what's most important. Last thing I'm going to say about all of this is that everyone watching this knows people in your own lives, yourself included, will fall into one of these categories. People who tend to worry more than the average person about all these things they can't control. And you know that it is consuming them and it is totally unhealthy for them. Then we know people on the opposite end who I think already get pilot versus passenger intuitively, or they might just be missing what I call the anxiety gene. I also sometimes frame this as the privilege of ignorance. These are people who just don't seem to pay much attention to a lot of these things happening in the broader world because they either just simply would rather bury their head in the sand, or they objectively think some of these things may not impact them. There's a war happening overseas. It may not impact me materially in the near term unless I feel it at the gas pump. So I don't even think about it. Or I work in a trade that I don't think is going to be materially impacted by what's happening with artificial intelligence. So as a result, why am I even paying attention to all of this? So that is what I call the privilege of ignorance. And sometimes that is a purposeful privilege of ignorance, and sometimes it just happens to be how people are wired. And then there's most of us who fall somewhere in between point A and point B, this spectrum. And we fall somewhere in there where we tend to worry about a lot of these things. And in other cases, we may not, because we compartmentalize our thinking. I think ultimately what we want to do is we want to be able to be in the best position to be present for ourselves and for our kids, for our families, and for our communities in the near future.
If you enjoyed today's conversation, like, follow, and subscribe to stay ahead of what's next. I'm Erica Orange.
And I'm Jared Weiner. Thanks for waking the future with us. We'll see you next time.